Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. This is the fourth edition of the India and Asia webinar series that ISAS runs. The series aims to unpack India's changing position in Asia in general as a rising power. And in particular, it asks what kind of roles can India play in the region and how do various countries of Asia view India and India's rise. In the last 3 months, we have discussed India's relationship with Maldives, with Philippines, with Japan. And today we are discussing a very important topic in my opinion, which is the India-ASEAN economic partnership. In the last 2 decades, this partnership has really grown. Today, ASEAN is India's third largest trading partner, and India is ASEAN's eighth largest trading partner. But still, there has been a lot of dissatisfaction with this relationship on both sides. And I think a couple of big factors that have been always at play is one, the sense that the true potential of this relationship has not been realized till now, both in terms of the quantum of trade, but also the complexity of supply chains and how closely the two economies are integrated, given their size and how fast they've grown in the last 2 decades. And the second concern, I think, is about the trade has also been persistent and been growing in the last 2 decades. And the trade deficit on the Indian side has been growing, which has given a lot of people in New Delhi a pause, and especially because it also involves a lot of geopolitical factors that go behind the scenes. And I think this year these issues have come to the forefront because the ASEAN-India Trade in Goods Agreement, AITIGA, is under review, which the two sides have promised to conclude the review by end of the year. Uh, but I think that the negotiations for this have brought many of these issues, but the issues always existed because in history, the trade agreements between India and ASEAN have had somewhat challenging aspects to them. The first modern trade agreement that India signed with the Southeast Asian country was with Thailand, which was an early harvest scheme, which was supposed to pave the way for an FTA. And 20 years later, still no FTA on that. And then famously, the other famous case is, of course, India stepping out of RCEP negotiations at the last moment a few years ago. Um, so beyond just ITIGA and ITIGA review, I think that this discussion can bring out deeper issues that exist in this relationship and the discomfort that the two countries have, or also the potential that this relationship has. So to discuss this very interesting and complex issue, we have two experts with us. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Seshadri, V.S. Seshadri, who is a senior fellow for economic security at Delhi Policy Group. He joined the Indian Foreign Service in 1978, and he served as India's ambassador to Myanmar and Slovenia. And he was also in charge of taking care of the WTO issues at the Ministry of Commerce in the 1990s. Since his retirement, he has been one of the most insightful commentators on how Indian government thinks about FTAs. And he's the author of the 2023 book, Free Trade Agreements of India and the World. And we have Dr. Jayant Menon, who is a visiting senior fellow at the Institute of Southeast Asian Studies, a neighbor of ISAS. His research focuses on trade and investment issues and economic development in nation region. He was previously the lead economist in the Office of Chief Economist of Asian Development Bank. And before that, he was an academic in Australia and spent almost a decade at the Monash University. He has numbered several papers and books to list here, but I see the number, just the number here are 15 books, 50 chapters and books, and 80 peer-reviewed journal articles. So with such a intellectual firepower, I will shut my mouth and learn from this event. So we can start with Dr. Seshadri, who will speak for 15 minutes. Then we will move on to Dr. Menon, and then we will open up for discussion. So Dr. Seshadri, over to you.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. And good afternoon to all of you, or good evening, as the case may be. And I really thank the Institute for South Asian Studies for inviting me to join this panel, and to Sandeep for his introductory remarks. And I do agree with much of what he has said at the beginning. What I will try to do is to share some Indian perspectives as well as, from what I could gather from industry sources, as also from some of the writings on the subject. I'm not aware of what the actual status of negotiations are, which are, of course, taking place behind closed doors. But as we know, 11 rounds of the review are now over. It does not look like the review will get completed within the year end, as earlier anticipated. This is even as the joint committee and the 8 subcommittees, I understand, have been meeting from time to time. The last time was in Jakarta in October last month. The ASEAN-India summit, which took place end last month, has in its remarks on the topic said that they have welcomed the progress so far made, asked both sides to build on the momentum and to leverage their economic complementarities. What I see from the reference to complementarity is perhaps a recognition that the two sides have several areas where they are also competing economies. The summit further reiterated that AITIGA should be more effective, user-friendly, trade facilitative, and responsive to current and global challenges. This summit guidance again shows a recognition that much has changed in the trading world and also in the evolution of FTAs generally since AITIGA came into force. They have urged these aspects to be taken into account to make AITIGA more current and effective. A month earlier to the summit, there was also the consultations which took place between the economic ministers of ASEAN and India. They in turn called for intensification of negotiation with a view to achieving substantial and balanced outcomes. So, balance is another aspect that needs to be kept in view. Now, all these are worthwhile messages to negotiators on both sides, but they are very general. For our discussion, I think it will be important to examine 3 aspects. One is how the ASEAN-India bilateral goods trade has progressed since the coming into force of the agreement in 2010. Now, it's well known that in India, there is a perception that it has not commensurately gained from the agreement. So it will be important to look at the trade trends carefully and see where it is headed. The second aspect, it will be necessary to take note of some unfinished agenda elements in the agreement itself, and what I would call as certain imbalances and commitments in the agreement. This again, I will elaborate a little later. Against this backdrop, the third aspect is how should the two sides be detailing the scope and goals of the review exercise. These are the 3 main elements that I'll think deal with. Let's then look at the bilateral trade. A year before AITIGA came into force, I'm talking about Indian statistics at the financial year 2008-9. India's exports to ASEAN were US $19 billion. And last year, that is 2024-25, for which we have figures, it stood at US approximately $38 billion. That is something like twice the figure. On the reverse direction, imports from ASEAN into India were US $26 billion in 2008-9, and these have risen to US $84 billion in 24-25. That's about more than 3 times, sorry. And the trade deficit itself, which was around US $7 billion in 2008-9, has gone up to US $46 billion by now, which is about 6 times. And this is an issue for us, considering and I highlight India's overall goods trade worldwide also has a substantial deficit element. This is unlike the ASEAN countries, most of which are export-oriented and have overall trade surplus and very small trade deficits, except perhaps for Philippines, which may be the only exception here. And what appears more concerning to the Indian industry are the very rapid increases seen in imports of certain items like electrical machinery and other machinery as well, metals and metal products, plastics, certain chemicals, and certain textile items. In fact, some of them over 5 to 6 times compared to 2008-9 figures. On the other hand, India's industrial exports to ASEAN have not seen similar growth, except perhaps a few items. Now, to some extent, this imbalance in trade growth is seen as a result of the imbalances in market access commitments by some major economies on the ASEAN side. While India eliminated tariffs on 75% of its tariff lines by the time the phase-out was complete. And the tariff reductions themselves, not elimination, but reductions themselves, covered about 85% plus of the tariff lines. But the offers or the commitments by the some of the major ASEAN economies were somewhat less. And this imbalance is seen even more in certain specific industrial sectors, be it relating to base metals, plastics, machinery items, auto parts, etc. I do not want to be naming particular economies here, but if there is an interest, we could go into those aspects as well, but that's not the thrust of my point here. And coupled with it are also concerns about non-tariff barriers. And I'm sure ASEAN countries also have their concerns in this regard. There are also certain drawbacks or shortcomings in AITIGA we need to recognize. One is the dual criterion, value addition criterion, that's origin criterion. 35% value addition plus a change in tariff subheading, which in my view makes it complicated in terms of implementation and documentation. These need to be perhaps eased to a single requirement of say 40% value addition that ASEAN normally has in its FTAs. Or there are the other numbers, but basically saying you have to simplify. And then there is the need to negotiate specific product-specific rules in AITIGA, which were provided for in the agreement, but never finalized. So it's an unfinished agenda item. And the mode of certification of rules of origin through simpler mechanisms like system of authorized exporters or other mechanisms that are now widely practiced. That said, we would also need to recognize scope for diversion of third country exports using AITIGA. So when we set out what needs to be done, I will focus on 4 or 5 aspects, and these include market access, rules of origin, standards and regulations, trade facilitation, and perhaps trade remedies. I will try to be brief. On market access, both India and ASEAN have signed more FTAs in the last several years. To make AITIGA effective, both sides need to see to what extent they can provide a level playing field to the other, vis-a-vis the market access provided to third countries. Otherwise, even if some further concessions are given, they may not be effective. The second point is it would be important to set right the imbalances in commitments from amongst ASEAN countries that I referred to earlier. The third aspect that I would emphasize is the need for attention to be given on how market access could be linked to promoting supply chains, particularly in certain strategic areas. I understand ERIA and the Center for WTO Studies have done some studies in this regard. While I am not aware of the outcomes, but certainly the negotiations could be informed of them and benefit also from those recommendations. On rules of origin, formulating product-specific rules certainly has to be a priority. And simplifying the dual value criterion that value addition criterion I mentioned earlier. Accumulation will be useful, but benefits from the FTA has to be confined to the parties and not for trade diversion from third countries. On certification and verification again, easing the process should be considered, but not at the cost of rigor and compliance. So these are very, very important, that balance needs to be kept. Trade facilitation, again, has seen enormous progress internationally in FTA regimes, particularly with the use of digital means. There is just one brief para on this in AITIGA. We need to bring in concepts like pre-arrival processing, advanced rulings, efficient and expeditious release of goods, and so on. Equally important, I feel, is the need for greater transparency and closer and prompt customs cooperation. I emphasize this because last year, for example, in 24-25, India had a case of $3 billion of gold imports disguised as platinum imports from one ASEAN country, because platinum enjoys zero duty in India. So these are things that certainly would need to be guarded against, and mechanisms will need to be there. Both SPS issues and standards regulations again are aspects that now feature as separate chapters in all FTAs, which again is something AITIGA should incorporate. Accelerating procedures for approval of pharmaceuticals is one area in which India will certainly be interested, and this features in some of the recent FTAs signed by India. There could also be others, like such as an organic products or agricultural items. Particularly useful, I feel, would be mutual acceptance of testing by each other's authorized testing agents. We are very proximate markets with low transit time. Such facilitational measures should help promote trade. Another area that I feel needs greater attention is trade remedies. An effective and prompt trade remedy system will be necessary to support more ambitious trade market access commitments. Countries should be able to deal with surges in imports promptly at a time when third country export diversions have become larger. This is at a time when the largest market in the world has moved to higher tariffs. Excess capacities elsewhere will then try to find a way to third markets. Volume triggers or other mechanisms could be considered while improvising safeguards in the agreement. So to sum up, the AITIGA review, in my view, is a very good opportunity to bring the agreement more in line with contemporary trends, provide a more level playing field for each party to the other, as also make it more balanced. But I would endorse the general guidance given by the economic ministers from India and ASEAN earlier this year, which is for the two sides to adopt a pragmatic and flexible approach, considering the diverse interests and sensitivities of our country. Now, India and ASEAN have elevated their partnership to a comprehensive strategic partnership on the occasion of the 30th anniversary of the dialogue partnership in 2022. It is important that both sides make the economic and trade pillar of these ties, which, as you rightly mentioned in your introductory remarks, have been lagging behind potential. These need to surge forward. One other point it would really have been ideal if the AITIGA review could have been accompanied by a review of the ASEAN-India Trade in Services, which again is quite light in terms of commitments, with also unfinished agenda of its own. It is noteworthy that at the last economic ministers' consultations, this aspect was taken note of, even as no decision has been taken. So finally, I would make the point that it is true that India's FTA focus in recent years is towards getting into such free trade agreements with what are seen as more complementary economies rather than competing ones. So you can see that our recent FTAs have included those with Australia, the UAE, EFTA countries, and the United Kingdom. But that said, I feel a well-crafted review that takes into account several of the aspects that I mentioned, I believe will be a plus for both India and ASEAN and for the larger strategic partnership. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Seshadri. That was very comprehensive and very to the detail and with a lot of fine print. And also I really appreciate the fact that you stuck to 15 minutes. You exactly finished in 15 minutes as we had discussed. Now I'll ask Dr. Menon to take over.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Sandeep. I trust you can see and hear me well. If not, you let me know. Okay, so listen carefully to Dr. Seshadri's very valuable contribution just now. And I think he has indeed shared a lot of very interesting ideas. So what I will try and do is, as much as possible, complement what has already been said, and maybe raise a few issues that are not completely, I don't completely agree with. I agree with almost all of it, but I think I think we have different views about how what role FTAs can play in the overall the common objective that we share in increasing trade and investment between these two, between India and Southeast Asia. And I very much see this as one by which it has to really happen through an increase in the participation in global value or global supply chains. I think this is where the future growth in trade between these two regions will come from, especially if, as Dr. Seshadri mentioned, if it's going to be more evenly balanced and, of course, more inclusive in the sense that it's also one in which contributes to improving the welfare of the lowest paid and the poor, pockets of which exist on both sides. Southeast Asia has not overcome poverty, and India is also facing that challenge. So, and I think it's interesting, this has already been mentioned, I won't spend too much more time on this, but these are two dynamic regions. India is growing rapidly, Southeast Asia is doing quite well still. They've gone through a lot of reforms, but I think the big difference between the two lies in the level of participation in global supply chains. Southeast Asia, of course, has transformed dramatically through its active participation in the key global supply chain industries of electrical and specialized machinery, automotive parts and components, and of course, electronics. And there's also pockets of textiles, clothing, etc., which the newer members of ASEAN are actively involved in. But in the three key elaborately transformed manufacturing industries, Southeast Asia has been very active. And I think when India increases its participation in these sectors, and with with greater integration with Southeast Asia, then I think we'll see the more even balance in trade that is a concern, I know, especially to a lot of Indian policymakers. I'll come back to that point about the relevance of these bilateral balances if I have time towards the end. But I think let me get into what I want to focus on, and that is how we can promote trade and investment between India and ASEAN, and also with the rest of the world. And I think there are two broad approaches in my view. The first is through the strengthening of regional institutions. By this, I'm referring to the non-FTA based institutions. So I think AITIGA has a role to play. I'll come to that later. But the non-FTA based institutions like BIMSTEC and SASEC and GMS, they also have an important role to play because they have a focus on delivering projects on the ground that improve connectivity, reduce trade costs, and deal with a lot of the behind the border barriers, which I think lie at the heart of a lot of the difficulties faced in increasing integration. I think we spend far too much attention looking for tariffs and looking at how to reduce them and also to change rules of origin to increase your utilization. I think the big changes will come from a lot of the non-tariff measures, and a lot of them involve national reforms, and I think this is where we should focus on. I think the second point, and this is the one that I will focus on mostly, is how to accelerate reforms by the way in which we implement the FTAs and other trade-specific instruments, right, including AITIGA. And I think this is where there are lessons that can be drawn from the ASEAN region. I think ASEAN's contribution is that it is the classic model of open regionalism. And despite a world that's becoming increasingly protectionist, I think this open regionalism is what will sustain it going forward. And perhaps even ironically, it's remaining open is what will allow it to deal with the whole anti-globalization backlash that we see gaining momentum and given a huge push by Trump 2.0. I think the upgrade of the AITIGA will be an important step in that direction if it deals with the remaining barriers. And as the ambassador mentioned, if it deals with the sorts of trade facilitation measures that are required to increase participation in global supply chains, but in a non-preferential or non-discriminatory manner. A lot of these sort of behind the border measures cannot be preferential by their very design. Once they're addressed with, it's very difficult to stop others from enjoying the benefits. And so they're naturally multilateral. And that's not a bad thing. This is one case in which free riding is actually a good thing because at the end of the day, global supply chains work when goods can move in and out of across borders, in and out of countries, and across borders quickly, cheaply, and efficiently. They have no room to try and utilize FTAs when it comes to this type of global supply chain trade, because by their nature, the value addition will be very small, right? They add a bit of value across multiple borders, and there's multiple border crossings. So designing, even simplified rules of origin is not the way to support this type of participation. the best rule of origin is the one that's not required. So if they multilateralize their preferences, then there's no longer a need to worry about the origin because there's no preferences to be handed out. And this is what ASEAN has been doing, right? ASEAN has multilateralized almost 95 and above of its tariff lines, so that the preferential AITIGA, not AITIGA, the ASEAN preferential tariff and the MFN tariff are the same for more than 95% of tariff lines. So when there are complaints about unequal market access, I'm not too sure where that's coming from, because most of the tariffs in ASEAN have been multilateralized at zero, very close to zero. There are a few important highly traded tariff lines which are not, and perhaps that's what where the concern lies. But by and large, there's not much really to negotiate when it comes to ASEAN's, especially the original members. The newer members are catching up, but the original members of ASEAN have by and large reduced their tariffs to just about zero and multilateralized them so that it's no longer preferential and available to India or any other country that wants to trade with it. Right. Okay. So I think, let me come back to the role of FTAs. So I think some see FTAs as a panacea, and that's why they're negotiating so many of them, while others see it as part of the problem, right? Because of the whole spaghetti bowl effect and, overlapping rules of origin. But both may be wrong to a certain extent. I think a lot depends on the underlying causes of the poor trade performance and how the FTA is used. I've already talked about the how with the multilateralization, but what is it that's driving poor trade performance? There have been various studies done by the ADB and BIMSTEC that point to a lot of the behind the border barriers as being the real problem to the lack of intra-regional trade in South Asia and between South Asia and Southeast Asia. And in fact, a lot of these are not typically covered by an FTA, right? And these include things, various non-tariff barriers, poor infrastructure, high logistic costs, cross-border transportation problems, and a host of inconsistent policies, and also a lack of supply capacity, right? These are the findings of those studies. I think they are quite convincing in their argumentation that this is where a lot of the problems actually lie. I think while India remains focused on negotiating and implementing more and more FTAs, it should also bear in mind that many of these issues require national actions and are not able to be addressed by FTAs or any upgrades to FTAs. And so you cannot actually address these other than national actions. So FTAs can only play a complementary role. The GMS experience is also instructive. I think it shows us that these types of non-FTA forums can deliver a lot when it comes to the behind the border problems. I don't have time to go into that, but SASEC has been trying to do the same thing. This is a program that's supported by ADB, but is actually owned by the countries of the region and open to contributions from all donors. So it's not just an ADB program, but a lot of the things that they're doing, I think, is the kind of things that will help increase India's participation in supply chains and promote greater interregional trade. rather than just focusing on the mercantilistic style of using FTAs and rules of origin to drive preferential trade. I think this is the point that I want to highlight when it comes to these sorts of issues. I think the ambassador correctly pointed out that the trade deficit has been growing, and India's overall trade deficit is large with the world. At some extent, that's a reflection of the savings investment imbalance. It's a macroeconomic issue, and it's not necessarily a problem for a developing country that wants to grow faster than its domestic savings rate will allow. So you basically borrow the savings of other countries, both in terms of loans and equity investments that allow you to grow at a much faster rate than your domestic savings rate will allow. Now, is the large bilateral deficit with ASEAN a problem? It's a problem if it contributes to the overall trade deficit of India in a way that threatens long-term debt sustainability, right? If it doesn't do that, then I don't see this as a problem requiring drastic measures for rectification, right? Trade is mutually beneficial. The idea that you only gain if you have a trade surplus or you lose because you have a trade deficit is misplaced. If it doesn't contribute to long-term debt unsustainability, if it does, then yes, there is a need to address the imbalance. But if it doesn't contribute to long-term debt instability, and there are no major market access issues causing unfair trade practices, then I think trade is mutually beneficial. And if India is going to run a trade deficit with anyone, I think it should run it with countries from Southeast Asia and perhaps even China. China is competitive in some of the most in a lot of the manufactured products produced internationally. And I know there's been concern that this agreement with ASEAN provides a backdoor entry for China to come into India. I've heard this many times. I don't see why this is a problem. If you're going to have a trade deficit, China being the most efficient producer for a lot of these products is the right country to have a trade deficit with. Not Africa, not even maybe some countries in Southeast Asia, but as long as it doesn't contribute, as I say, to overall long-term debt instability. And it's a question of whether you think there's been unfair trade practices. China has to address the huge amount of subsidies that it provides to its firms. That's a well-known problem, and that I think is a different issue. If it's providing inputs, right, then subsidized inputs into exports is actually a gift to the country importing it if it's then used for exports to other parts of the world. And a lot of the growth that the ambassador pointed to in the import items are inputs into production. India has a large domestic market to serve, but a lot of these inputs would also be important to improve its exports over time. So I think I'm just about out of time. I don't know if I have, do I still have a few more minutes to talk about Trump? Yeah? Okay. So I think the other issue now is that, we've seen that with Trump 2.0, the US is going out of its way to present itself as an unreliable trade partner. I don't think this is a glitch or a short-term phenomenon. I think uh, this will see through to the next term, especially if there's another Republican president, and assuming that Trump leaves. But even if it's not a Republican, I think this is a systemic shift in the way in which US politics views trade. It's been building up for quite a while. Trump has just taken it one step further. There's been disenchantment on both sides of the House with this sort of hollowing out, and the anti-globalization sentiment has grown, and now it's received a lot of voice through Trump, and this will be irreversible, I feel. And so Southeast Asia and India need to look at increasing trade and investment as the US becomes more nationalistic. And I think the opportunities are there for them to increase that kind of relationship. Of course, as the ambassador said, it's difficult at a time when everyone is trying to diversify, and China has a lot of excess industrial capacity, and they will be looking at finding new markets for it. And there are concerns in Southeast Asia as well about China dumping some of those industrial products in this region. And Indonesia has dumping claims on China. Some of those imports, of course, have Southeast Asian value added in them. So this is the beauty of supply chains, right? That nothing is produced from start to end in one country. So you do have this mutually beneficial, scenario coming through interdependence. So what China produces is not produced 100% in China, right? When I measured this in 2018, on average, a made-in-China product has about a third of its value added in China, right? Of course, this varies by product, but that's the average for manufacturing. This would have increased since then, but not by much. So, you're probably looking at about 40% or so as the average now. But so where the other 60% comes from, other parts, and a lot of that is in Southeast Asia. And when India, I think, participates more actively in the supply chain networks of the region, they too will have a share of that pie. And so I think that's where a lot of the future lies. And the final markets, I think, will have to come from other parts of the world other than the US. The US is not going anywhere. I mean, it's still going to be a market for the region. But I think the current high level of dependence, especially from many Southeast Asian countries, will need to come down. And there are already measures in place to try and reduce the high dependence on the US market. The question is who will replace the US? Well, the EU is an obvious high-income region that Southeast Asia is looking at. I'm sure India is also looking at. But I think there's also an attempt to try and increase collaboration between EU, RCEP, and CPTPP members. And India should come in to that grouping, because that's where I think the future landscape of or architecture will evolve around. We've had Anne Kruger suggest the WTO being revived without the US, because I think she's right in her view that the US is the problem with reducing the effectiveness of the WTO. But I think hand in hand with that, a new architecture which involves the EU, RCEP and CPTPP is also evolving, and India needs to find a way to come into that. And I think that's where, a lot of the unevenness in trade balances can be addressed going forward. So, okay, so I might have upset a few people enough by now. So let me stop there, and happy to take questions. Thanks, Sandeep.
Thank you so much. These were fantastic. Please, whoever has questions, please put them in the Q&A box, or you can just message me with them. In the meantime, I have several questions, but I'll start with a couple, one for each, but please feel free to answer either of the questions. I thought that this was very interesting, not just in terms of talking about the technicality of the relationship, but also in terms of perhaps revealing the different worldview or different approaches to thinking about this issue that is on both sides. And I think that comes across in that fundamental difference in, I suppose, ideological approach of how we think about these issues, right? I mean, the idea of, say, in India, thinking about that, let's have more push towards complementary economies rather than competitive economies, while in Southeast Asia, the perspective being that more you engage with each other, more you become complementary by nature of it, and the idea of openness. And I was really struck by the idea of FTAs being a problem in some ways to, in some ways hindering the supply chain issue. So let me ask a couple of questions. One is about the politics of the negotiation. Ambassador Seshadri, I'm hoping you can talk about this a little bit. Where do you think given that the AITIGA has had 11 rounds and still is not really concluded, and even before that, there was a long history of India asking for it, and then the review didn't start to begin with. What's the politics of it? How would you rank various disagreements? Is the biggest disagreement or biggest concern on Indian side, for example, maybe the Chinese goods being routed, or is it about the Southeast Asian countries not lowering the tariff lines enough, or is it about something else? And what do you feel is the concern on the Southeast Asian side? Where are the disagreements and how are they prioritized? And from a political perspective, who do you think has the leverage here? How is the leverage playing out in this negotiation? Where is the political leverage? And Dr. Mehta, I have a rather broad question, which is, I think, something that a lot of people in India would be very interested in, which is about comparing with China, right? I mean, there's a sense that the economic model, even though Indian economy is very different in many ways than China, the idea is that the broader idea is that in some way the path to follow is the China path, right? Or become the next China. And where do you think is the divergence in the last 20, 30 years between India's approach to Southeast Asia and the trade and China's approach, given that we are at such different outcomes, both in terms of the deepening of integration, the quantum of trade, the supply chains integration, which is very different between China, like how China and ASEAN is, and versus how India and ASEAN is, and also about the fundamental nature that China has a huge trade surplus with ASEAN, and India has a trade deficit. So it's fundamentally at a very different trading relationship that the two are sitting. So what is different? And is it more to do with the inherent competitiveness, national competitiveness of the industry? Or is it more to do with the policy approach that the two countries have taken, especially when it comes to FTAs and other things? So where would you think is the difference coming from to a certain degree? Ambassador Seshadri, do you want to start?
Yeah, I would answer 2 points. One is I think it is very, very important for the negotiators to go into more details, particularly on the tariff imbalance issue. Dr. Suresh Menon mentioned that the differential between the MFN tariffs and preferential tariffs is almost non-existent or 95% of tariff lines. I would be grateful if this is borne out because I have looked at the trade policy reviews of many of the ASEAN economies, and I have written about it also in a DPG brief. There are issues there where in areas of particular interest to India, there are relatively higher tariffs. And cotton yarn, for example, if you see, there are other products. I don't want to go into details at this stage, but there are issues where India has some strength, and there are issues there. So we need to go into details, see where there are imbalances. And that is why I drove the reference to what the economic ministers have said. Look at sensitivities of each other. See if you can come to some accommodation. I think this is a very, very important aspect, rather than going with a mind that ASEAN is already the most well-integrated economy, and it is India which needs to come up to the table. I think that is the approach that is taken. It will not go forward. It's very, very important to understand what India is trying to say, what Indian industry is trying to say. And I think if we look at also the supply chain aspect, which is very, very important, and I mentioned we should look at the recommendations of both ERIA and Center for WTO Studies, their reports, and see if there are certain sectors in which we can try to promote supply chain by again, mutual accommodation, go into detail. So that is one aspect that I would put as the broad element. The second aspect that I would like to really underline is to highlight, overly highlighting the economic efficiency aspect. And in a sense, not emphasizing so much the economic dominance that is coming into play. In fact, if there is one aspect that comes out of US's approach, it is that this model of excess capacities, of consciously trying to create economic dependence, that in turn can be subsequently used for political purpose. We have seen this demonstration already in the area of critical minerals, etc. This is not sustainable. And particularly large economies like India would like to ensure that even if it is not economically efficient, we would like to have more dependability, more de-risk. So this is yet another aspect that has to come into the negotiations. So I think these are elements which will need to be factored in, and simply going on the basis of economic efficiency, promoting a supply chain at any cost would not work. And the last aspect is, yes, I fully accept Dr. Menon's point of view about trade balance. It's not necessary that you have to have balance. As long as you can sustain it, developing economies do that. We all know that. But you also again have to see where this becomes a little unsustainable. If India, for example, if our exports can finance only 62% of our imports, just this ratio is exactly similar to the United States. We have to look carefully where is it that we can reduce dependence on imports. That's certainly a factor which is very much there in the mind. And hence, therefore, you also are aware of the production-linked incentive schemes and other aspects that have come into play as part of the Indian development process. So these are all aspects that India has to keep in mind. And if we have launched those programs, we naturally would like to ensure that those gain fruition. Until then, there is a certain degree of protection for those industries. So these elements, again, form part of our development process. And it's a large economy, unlike some of the ASEAN countries, which are smaller, which can more easily hedge bets with the different relationship with different countries. So, in a sense, therefore, ASEAN will have to, I think, show some understanding to these aspects rather than come to the table by saying that, look, we have done much better than you in terms of making our economy more dynamic, more free, and so on. That's the point I'll make. Thank you.
Dr. Jain?
Yeah, so I think your question was about how what can we learn from China or the East Asian model more generally, I guess. Let's not just focus on China, but and where are the lessons? I think there's yeah, I mean every development experience is a bit different, but there might be some commonalities that we can look at. Certainly for Southeast Asia, which I know more than any other region, perhaps, we tried the import substitution, right? As did India, as did many countries, and this didn't work, right? We tried for many years, and then decided to switch. I guess Southeast Asia switched a bit sooner than India did, and it's worked very well for Southeast Asia by and large, right? Poverty has come down very sharply in most countries. They've been open to foreign investment, and that has been the fuel in the engine of growth, and that that whole the FDI has helped the integration into global supply chains. I mean, initially from Japan, when we had the first U.S. bilateral trade tensions in the 90s, between the U.S. and Japan. They didn't have a trade war because Japan needs the U.S. for its security for its national security alignments. So they can't go into a confrontational stance with the U.S. So they agreed to allow their currency to appreciate to such a point that we then had the lost decade in Japan, right? But that actually was the first wave of investments in Southeast Asia and the early emergence of supply chain production in the region. The current U.S.-China, trade dispute has a lot of similarities with the U.S.-Japan dispute, right? Again, this focus on the bilateral balance, like with Japan, unfair trade practices was mentioned. And China is now investing heavily in Southeast Asia, right? So we're seeing a repeat of that from the 1990s, a new version of it, but this time instead of Japan, it's China. So Southeast Asian supply chains are still very much China-centered, right? And they've benefited from that. And this is not going to change, whatever the U.S. tries to do. The U.S. is working on moving China as much as possible out of supply chains, but it won't happen, right? You cannot dismiss China. China is everywhere, and that's the nature of supply chains. And on the point of, I mean, I'm not saying, pursue participation in supply efficiency and supply chains at any cost, not at all. But it is, what these countries have done and benefited from. Of course, politics and comes into play. The ambassador talked about the critical minerals, and I guess here he's referring to how China imposed restrictions on the export of critical minerals in their negotiations with the US. But this was simply mirroring what the US has been doing with its super chips, right? Which President Biden intensified, right? The US has been just as culpable in weaponizing trade policy. I think China responded to that eventually when, Trump went haywire, right, with his tariff policies. And this is all coming out this is all part of the negotiating tactic, of course. We know that this restriction on critical minerals will be removed, right? But let's see if the US does the same with its chips. I don't think it will. And the US has been the big bully here, and it's bullied India as well, right? Slapping 50% tariffs on India when the US itself imports, uranium and even, cold water fish from Russia. This is the height of hypocrisy, right? So if you're concerned about China weaponizing policy, the master weaponizer is the US. And its student, the EU, right? And they've been pursuing this for decades. But anyway, so I think, outer-oriented policies that encourage investments in a non-discriminatory way and trade in a non-discriminatory way, using FTAs as building blocks for globalization rather than just regionalism, is the lesson to come out of Southeast Asia. And that's where I think India can also benefit. I don't think Southeast Asia is going into any negotiation saying we've done everything and now you need to do the same. But I think it's also true to say that Southeast Asia has been on the liberalization path for a lot longer than India has because of the switch from import substitution to export promotion decades before India, right? So that's what they have been doing, and that's a reality. And there's data on this. In fact, it's an ERIA area study that I was involved in that measured this multilateralization of tariff preferences. And I'm happy to share that. It's not to say, like I said, it's about 95% of tariff lines. And of course, what are the remaining 5% are the ones that are more heavily traded. So it's not a trade-weighted measure. It's a simple tariff lines measure, 95 of lines. And it's the 5% that might matter to many countries. And I think, that's certainly true. And every country will have its pet peeve. And this is why you have these negotiations.
Thank you very much. I have a couple of questions that I'm just throwing up, and please pick the one that you would like to, or both of them if you want to address them. One is about China. Clearly, it's a big concern for India. I mean, and for, I think, not so much economic reasons as geopolitical reasons. I mean, the famous case is a few months ago, the Indian Commerce Minister called Southeast Asia China's B team, which clearly angered a lot of people in this region. And the larger concern is that Southeast Asia in some way is a backdoor for Chinese goods, even though India directly buys enormous amounts of goods from China. China is usually the first or second largest trade partner of India directly. But given that geopolitical concern exists, and I don't think that will go away anytime soon, is there a way to overcome the concern that exists, right? I mean, because it feels like there are three possibilities here. One is the one which is actually being done, which is, I feel, a suboptimal outcome, which is that India is hesitant in opening up its market further to Southeast Asia to a certain degree because of the concern of the Chinese goods being rerouted and creating these onerous RO conditions and things like that. Is there a way for either Southeast Asia to convince or to reassure India in some way that actually is in India's interest, foregoing some of these concerns? Or is there a way to create some kind of reassurance mechanism, a surveillance mechanism or something of this sort, which demonstrates that there is a certain daylight between Southeast Asian trade with India and with Chinese trade in India. I mean, thinking about it in a way where China is everywhere in Southeast Asian economy does actually then fan a lot of those concerns in New Delhi that then there is no way to overcome this problem, right? And is there a conceivable method in which Southeast Asia can overcome this concern of China rerouting its goods through India, through Southeast Asia into India, right? Is there a reassurance mechanism of some sort that can be conceived? And the second the second question I have is about services, which Ambassador Seshadri already mentioned a little bit. India has a lot of trade deficit in goods, but usually has trade surplus in services. Theoretically, we don't. The data is very much more patchy when it comes to trade and services. Does it make sense to a certain degree to think about India's relationship with, say, ASEAN or other countries in the world, not in terms of just trade deficit in goods, but a collective view about trade and services together, and it's seeing it in that regard, right? And thinking about if that is creating deficit or is that creating surplus, or how is that playing out? Because in many ways, the countries that India has goods deficit with sometimes have services surplus. So how does that work out? Is there a way that point of view can be shifted from where it is right? Yeah. Ambassador Seshadri, you want to go first?
Yeah, I do not want to talk too much about the China factor here because I don't know if that is the focus of our discussion. But we do have a substantial trade deficit with China as well. And in fact, China's exports to India last year were 8 times India's exports to China. So there are issues there, including in terms of how our exports have not been able to find fair access into that market. And this applies to Southeast Asia as well. For example, pharmaceutical products, an area in which India has particular strength, which we export in substantial volume to the US, to the EU. So in terms of acceptance by developed markets, it has not been an issue. So the question arises, why do these have problems in accessing Southeast Asian markets? So there is an issue there. And this is also true in the Chinese market. Now, you can say we are very open, but that's not the message that comes across when we go through the approval processes and so on. And these are not transparent. These are very opaque. So these are issues that need to be gone into some detail. And so I will leave it there. The second aspect, you talked about linking services and goods. In fact, that is one aspect that I have stressed all along in my writing. And this is one area we find not so great openness that we see in the Southeast Asian when we talk about services agreement. In fact, the ASEAN-India Trade Services Agreement is a very, very light agreement in terms of commitments. And this is an area we would like to see more progress. Certainly it should be reviewed as well with bringing it up to line with what ASEAN has accepted with other partners in recent times. So there has to be some kind of give and take. If there is progress in goods, which may favor ASEAN more on the goods side, I think some giving should be there on the services side, where the other side has shown some demonstrable strength. But if there is reluctance there, then there is a problem. I leave it there.
Dr. Menon?
Right. Yeah. So, I think we can end on a note of agreement. I too don't want to focus in on China because I think we shouldn't worry about individual countries or bilateral flows or bilateral balances in these sorts of relationships unless there's overwhelming evidence that a particular country is being absurdly unequal in its market access. And I don't think that case has been made certainly not in Southeast Asia. I accept that there are particular areas, pharmaceuticals, yes. I mean, even Singapore, to some extent, the most open of all the economies, would not want to jeopardize its own industries, and there's a lot of IP issues and so on involved. And so maybe there's grounds for negotiations to proceed to improve India's access to this region in those sorts of areas. Yeah, I fully accept that. But on services, I think this is the fastest growing area of trade, and this is also where most of the barriers are still very much in place, and many of the barriers are binding. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done in liberalizing services that will, benefit countries like India disproportionately. So I think that's where the future challenges lie in addressing a lot of the barriers to services trade. And once those barriers are addressed, I think the overall deficits that some countries face will narrow. And I think that's where, that's the all comparative advantage story coming into play as well, right? Yeah. And so there's an unequal level of restriction currently on services versus goods. And that imbalance needs to be corrected, and it will benefit countries like India more so than many other countries in Southeast Asia. Yeah.
Let me just, I know that we are short on time, and Dr. Menon, you have to go to another event. So let me just wrap up with a couple questions that we got from audience. One is, you started, Dr. Menon, you started your remarks with talking about the need for, the catering to the poor and the wider population. And there's a question related to that, which is that there's an emerging youth unrest in some countries of South and Southeast Asia, both recently in Indonesia and Nepal, partly in response to economic growth that has not been equitably shared. To what extent are India-ASEAN economic and strategic initiatives designed to address the needs and aspirations of younger demographics? And the second question, just so that we do the two questions in this round, is something that we have been already discussing somewhat, which is that for Southeast Asia and India, managing their interdependence with China will become a key. How do you think ASEAN India as a bloc can do that, especially in critical minerals? How important would political leaders can shape that, and how do you think increased weaponization would impact economic alliance formation? I think, that is, even though China is very closely integrated with Southeast Asia, there are some countries in Southeast Asia who do have geopolitical discomfort about overdependence on China. So these two questions, yeah. Should we reverse the order this time? Dr. Menon, you go
Okay.
first.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, what was the first question again? It was, on whether it would affect whether it was inclusive growth that was being pursued. I don't know if this is explicitly the target, but I think one interesting fact is the World Development Report. I think in 2017 or so, looked at how global supply chains affected incomes of the poorest versus non-global supply chain trade. And they found that these are lifted a lot more significantly because they're much more labor absorbing. And in developing countries, they bring in low-skilled workers into much more rewarding, better paid jobs. And very often they involve the increased number of two-income households. So in some parts of the world, a lot of women also got wage employment. So I think, again, I come back to this idea that, measures that support greater integration into global supply chains will be the way to address the unequal distribution of gains from liberalization. And that's a real problem. And I think this is a problem now that might be seriously exacerbated by AI, right? China is no longer a low-wage country, right? But it's able to compete in so-called low-wage input products because of its high level of robotics and, of course, its scale, right, of manufacturing production. So, and this is, again, part of that whole China story of how it's been able to adapt so quickly to its changing domestic circumstances. So when wages started rising sharply, it adopted, mechanization and robotics in a way that, we have not seen anywhere else. And also the scale of its operations is also unmatched, right? Robotics is not going to help the poor, right? It's going to displace them. So I think that's a challenge for this region, and we need to get on top of this and ensure that AI works for us, and we don't end up actually suffering the consequences of rising inequality, not just within country, but between countries as well. Yeah.
Ambassador Shetty?
Yes, I think I would go along with what has been mentioned by Mr. Menon, except that, countries also have to be aware to what extent these kind of models that bring in dependence, which supply chains invariably bring, are balanced in some ways through interdependence. In fact, that is, interdependence was the model on which Bretton Woods system came into being. But if some partners wish to push this towards one-sided dependence, then there is a problem, because it can potentially give rise to various issues. This has to be looked at very carefully. Second aspect, which also is something that India is also looking into, because one of our key goals is to increase the share of manufacturing in the GDP, which is about 12% or so at the moment, which is very, very low compared to ASEAN countries, which are about 20% plus. So this is another aspect that comes in. Of course, to the extent that greater promotion of supply chains can help enhance this, we should certainly be open to looking at, and the government is looking at those issues. But at the same time, if we are also open about, for example, steel or other strategic items, where there could be imports of excess capacities being directed by other countries, we need to be careful as well, because that not only makes us more dependent, but also it hurts our manufacturing and share of manufacturing in GDP. So those are elements that need to be carefully balanced. So I would not go ahead with the efficiency theory in full, but look at all these aspects, particularly for a large growing economy like India, and see how we can push forward. And I think this understanding, if we can get into the India-ASEAN Trading Groups Agreement negotiations, I think there will be possibilities. That's how I see it.
Before we go, just a very quick question, Dr. Seshadri. I don't want to put you on the spot, and I know you are not part of the government anymore. You are an outside analyst. But do you think there is even a possibility of negotiations breaking down in India, pulling out of AITIGA or something like that? Is that in the realm of possibility?
I do not think so. I have not heard of this. But I think we have to look at it very positively. But at the same time, I think each side should not take the other for granted. It's very, very important. And see how we can move forward in line with that's why I took some time to recall the sentiments expressed by the ASEAN summit leaders, ASEAN economic ministers, which all look at how can we have it done. And that is the spirit in which the two sides should look at. And also the other aspect, if we can bring in services to some extent, I think that will be helpful rather than trying to separate the two. Because the last time we did it, there was no leverage as such. And that didn't help very much. I think if we can put the two together, that would be another huge way forward in terms of making it possible. That would be my submission.
Thank you very much. This has been a fantastic conversation. I learned a lot, and I think that not only because of your expertise, but I think also the different perspectives in themselves were extremely revealing, and the geopolitics behind it, and the various ways of thinking about economics. But I know that we are tight on time, so I won't go on any longer. Thank you very much for a very interesting to both our panelists. Thank you very much for a very interesting conversation, and thank you for the audience. Thank you to the audience for attending. We will come back with a new India-Asia webinar in January. Till then, happy holidays, and once again, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you.